This is not an infomercial for the police. This is not a puff piece. This is going to be a real whole and just a complete telling of the story.
Nearly 8 years after the Netflix docuseries Making a Murderer told the story of a wrongfully convicted man, later found guilty of murder, a rebuttal series debuts.
I believe the side of the story that we're telling is simply the truth and the whole truth, not departed.
Thanks for joining us here on Law and Crime. I'm Angenette Levy. The murder of Teresa Halbach was a huge story in the Green Bay area of Wisconsin back in 2005. I covered this case from beginning to end, but really, sometimes it feels like it never ends. Halbach's disappearance and death, and the story of the two men serving life in prison for her murder, Steven Avery and his then 16-year-old nephew, Brendan Dassey, became known internationally through the 2015 Netflix series, Making a Murderer. In 2003, DNA evidence exonerated Avery of a rape conviction. He was a celebrity of sorts in Wisconsin and the poster boy for the state's Innocence Project. He was suing the county responsible for his wrongful conviction at the time of Halbach's disappearance and claimed he was being framed to get the county out of the lawsuit. Avery's arrest was a shock, but perhaps not as shocking as the arrest of his nephew months later. Making a Murderer launched an international movement to free Avery and Dassey, but prosecutors and members of law enforcement cried foul, saying Making a Murderer was heavily edited, left out crucial details, and wasn't a documentary at all, but rather an advocacy piece. Now a rebuttal series, Convicting a Murderer, is airing on a conservative streaming service, DailyWire Plus, hosted by Candace Owens. I spoke with Candace Owens and director Shawn Rech about the series. Shawn, thanks for coming on. We appreciate it.
And Jeanette, thanks for having me, and thanks for being a part of the movie that we're about to talk about.
Yes, full disclosure, I was interviewed for this many years ago. I didn't know if anything would ever come of it. It was kind of radio silence there for a long time. And then I got this surprise text one day that the film was coming out. So first of all, Convicting a Murderer is supposed to be a response to Making a Murderer, which was a huge hit on Netflix back in late 2015, early 2016. Got people interested in a case that I always found to be very interesting. So I want you to tell me, Shawn, why you decided to do this film, why you got involved in this project, because there was so much support for Steven Avery and Brendan Dassey around the world. Some people don't support them, but a lot of people do.
Well, I watched Making a Murderer, and I really enjoyed it. As a filmmaker, my first documentary, A Murder in the Park, that you mentioned, was just had come out. And Making a Murderer boosted our numbers because they started to make lists of movies you need to see. If you're craving Making a Murderer type stuff, here's 10 more things to watch. The Jinx, The Thin Blue Line, and we were on most of those lists. So they helped us. Making a Murderer helped us, and it helped the true crime industry as a whole. But when I watched it, I believed it. And I just, as a filmmaker, thought, boy, they really didn't close some of these loops. Like, what happened with that blood vial? That was a bomb. Like, why didn't they follow up on that?
Avery claimed at trial that his blood, found in Teresa Halbach's vehicle, had been planted from a vial of his own blood that was in storage at the Manitowoc County Clerk of Courts from his wrongful conviction case. Rech said after watching the series, he started reading things that made him question what he had seen on Netflix.
It didn't take more than 2 weeks for Catherine Schultz in The New Yorker to write a long-form piece tearing Making a Murderer to shreds and laying out a very good case for why we were all lied to. And I said, boy, somebody is going to make a rebuttal series, and I can't wait to watch it.
Rech would end up directing the rebuttal series in 2018 when filming started, but they had to get members of law enforcement to agree to take part.
They said that they trust us with this story. And they said, we'll let you do it. And I said, okay, great, but we're going to report. This is pure journalism, so if we find out you did something wrong, we'll film them walking you into prison. This is not an infomercial for the police. This is not a puff piece. This is going to be a real whole and just a complete telling of the story. And, we do have a somewhat of a pro law enforcement bias now, having, conducted our own investigation. And, having Brenda Schuler, who's probably the foremost subject matter expert on this case as the producer of the film, was very helpful too. So that's why we made it. Nobody else did. And it took 6 years, and nobody wanted to buy it in Hollywood because everybody was afraid to upset Netflix. But that's why it ended up in the DailyWire, and I'm glad they had the courage and backbone to take this project on.
The Daily Wire is a conservative outlet. Candace Owens,
So this is the infamous Avery lot.
who's known for her conservative political commentary, is hosting Convicting a Murderer.
You say this is a work of journalism. So how is she fronting this when she's somebody who is very political and she's talking about White Lives Matter in the first episode of this?
That's about as political as it gets, though. It's not a political film. It's a film about culture and ethics. This is the first time we added a layer of commentary ever in any of my television work and any of my films. This is the first time we ever had this commentary added, but I don't think it hurts the experience. The viewer can reject it. The viewer can make up their own mind based on the very sound reporting in the background.
I got involved actually quite late in the project. So we were looking for something to do next following my last year's documentary kind of exposing Black Lives Matter as an organization. And I obviously am very obsessed with the concept of psychology and propaganda, and how really once the media gets behind an effort and says something is, nobody suspects that it plausibly cannot be so. So as we were looking for this project, Dallas, one of the producers that's on it, brought this forward and was talking about the Steven Avery case, which was something that I just obviously remember because every single person was talking about this when this happened back in 2015. I mean, it was a huge experiment for Netflix and the docuseries, and I was immediately interested and wanted to get involved. So they had always wanted to bring this true to the public, didn't really have the right voice to do it. Definitely a lot of things that we got behind and creatively thought this is the best way to tell this side of the story, which I believe the side of the story that we're telling is simply the truth and the whole truth, not departed.
What has the response been so far? I know it's only been up for a few days, maybe going on a week, because you offered some of the episodes free.
It's been huge, and it's been amazing because when I had first announced that we were doing this project, I actually got a lot of, I wouldn't say hate mail, but more, I would say just passionate emails from people that are fans of mine already, that know me in terms of politics. And this is kind of departed from politics. We're kind of stepping right into culture here. And they were like, no, Candace, don't get involved. Like, you don't understand this. We've been researching this for years. You couldn't possibly understand this. I want to keep liking you. And that made me even more excited about the project, because I always want an opportunity to prove somebody wrong, or an opportunity to show them what we're actually trying to do. And it has had a great response. It's the #2 documentary right now on according to Rotten Tomatoes. At least it was this morning. It might be #1 now. Millions of people have already seen it, and everyone is just saying, wow, 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 wow. Why did Netflix leave this out? And some people who are rushing, who haven't seen every episode, are saying, well, they left it out because it wasn't allowed in the courtroom. And that is to say, the documentary makers weren't limited to what was put into the courtroom. There are things that they could have shown you.
Convicting a Murderer features interviews with members of law enforcement who investigated Teresa Halbach's murder and searched Steven Avery's property. One of them is Andrew Colborn, a former Manitowoc County Sheriff's deputy accused of planting evidence by Avery's defense at trial. That sheriff's office was part of Avery's wrongful conviction lawsuit, and Colborn had been deposed weeks prior. Members of that sheriff's office shouldn't have been allowed on the property to assist.
One of the things that's really amazing is being able to have those officers there and to let them in the docuseries admit their blunders. And I always have to remind people of this. Officers are human beings. We never know what we're going to do right in the moment. You get a call. You're never thinking a case is going to be nearly as big as it is. You think this is police work. I mean, how many times do you think that they get a case that is going to be a national sensation in a place as tiny as Manitowoc County? Never. It happened once, So you're talking about woulda, coulda, shoulda. Hindsight is always 20/20. I think a lot of times what happens is we think that police officers are what we see on TVs. And I said this in the documentary in a later episode, that you think it's 1,000 police officers. They're all different. You never picture a tiny town. You don't think about the same police officers being used over and over again because you just don't have those sorts of resources in a tiny town. And you don't think about human error, right? Because you're looking at perfectly written scripts and these cops are excellent and they're getting it just right. Real life is not like the movies. Real life is not like TV. Human beings are flawed. Police officers make mistakes all the time, just like firefighters make mistakes the whole time, just like you and I make mistakes in our day-to-day lives.
Convicting a Murderer will also look at the case of Brendan Dassey. He is Steven Avery's then 16-year-old nephew who was convicted of both murder and rape. Dassey maintains his confession was coerced and false because he had a lower IQ.
I see people are more sympathetic to Brendan Dassey, and I understand that sympathy because he's so young. The concept of a 16-year-old kid getting, swept up in this because of his uncle, and I don't want to give anything away, but once we see more of his testimony and you see what his motivations were, they're very childish. They're very teenage-ish. It's, he did something maybe because his uncle said it was cool, in the same way that your uncle calls you over and says, hey, smoke a joint, it's going to be cool, whatever it is. There's this peer pressure factor. But the truth is that when I think about how Teresa was killed, that sympathy goes away, because I think that when I was 16, I definitely had the moral capability to know that this is something like that would be completely wrong, that you would just be uncomfortable, that you'd say, hey, no. So yes, do I feel badly? Do I know that if Steven Avery wasn't his uncle, that Brendan Dassey would probably obviously not be sitting in prison? The answer to that is yes, but I would feel so uncomfortable saying that I feel sympathetic to him, knowing how she was murdered. I'm not there yet. So it's one of those things that I'm not quite ready to answer, but I'm interested to see how everybody else feels when they hear his testimony and what his motivations were. But obviously I don't hold the same vitriol for him as I do for Steven Avery, I think is fair to say.
He is an extremely tragic figure. If what he told police in his original interview was true, then he had an opportunity to save Teresa's life and didn't. So he's obviously limited intellectually and developmentally, but his mom said in a phone call, "Why didn't you tell me? We could have saved her. You could have been the hero." He said, "Because I would have gotten in trouble." So he knows wrong from right. So it's terrible. If he would have pled out, he would be out today. Instead, the Avery family, especially Pa Avery, it's in the movie. We have the whole recording. He calls him up and says, "You are firing your attorney. You are not taking any plea deal." These were instructions from the top, and that's why he's sitting in prison right now.
Stick to your guns, I think, is what he told him.
Say nothing happened, They made me say all of this. Tell them that, and stick to your guns.
Do you think Brendan should be in prison for the full 41 years or so until he's eligible for release?
Personally, no. I think that's a really rough sentence for someone who didn't premeditate this crime. I think that he's probably done enough time, in my opinion. But I didn't sit through that trial. What happened to Teresa was horrible. But if it weren't for Steven Avery, Brendan would have just been playing video games. He would never have done something like this on his own organically. By all accounts, he was a sweet kid, and was just dragged into this by this evil guy who needed some help carrying stuff around and cleaning up.
Brendan Dassey and Steven Avery have exhausted all of their appeals, although Steven Avery's current attorney continues to file motions in the hope of winning him a hearing and a new trial. Convicting a Murderer will stream on DailyWire Plus through October, with new episodes premiering each Thursday. For Law and Crime, I'm Angenette Levy.